Karl Marx is one of the most famous and influential thinkers of all time, and his ideas still hold a great sway over sections of the political left. Yet Marx had been proven emphatically wrong on virtually every word he had written, even before he died in 1883. Marx had claimed that capitalism must necessarily increasingly impoverish the working man. Instead, the working man saw his pay and material conditions continue to rise spectacularly. Marx forecast that the middle classes would completely die out. Instead, their numbers increased beyond all possible expectation. Marx was adamant that a period of bourgeois materialism would inevitably result in revolution. Instead, it's proven to be the most cast-iron deterrent to revolution in human history. And Marx was also sure that the socialist future would be a utopia, a brotherhood of man where equanimity and equality would reign. This was a bizarre forecast, for the socialists of his time, and of every time since, were riven with bitter and irreconcilable factional rifts. Marx, and all of his peers, spent far more time fighting with and attempting to destroy each other than they ever did their rivals. He spent years denouncing the likes of Lassalle and Bakunin, and sought mastery of the revolutionary movement, determined to destroy any rival for that position, like any true dictator. It's little surprise then that the states he inspired, those based on his teaching, were such catastrophic failures. And, in contrast to his defenders, they were not just authoritarian despotism that discarded his message. For Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot and the rest followed Marx's advice to the letter. They collectivised agriculture, the state seized the means of production, quotas were determined by central planning rather than the market, but everything that Marx expected to result in abundance, freedom and happiness led instead to deprivation, poverty, misery and enslavement. Marx had claimed that the dictatorship of the proletariat would simply wither away. Instead, it became ever more bloated, controlling, arrogant and violent. All of this is well established, but I'd like to focus on one of Marx's lesser known but equally outrageous blunders. One of the great features of international politics in the 19th century was the rivalry between Britain and Russia, that long tussle for dominance that came to be known as the Great Game. Britain sought to protect her imperial dominions from Russian interference, so probed deep into Afghanistan, with disastrous results. And both great states took an intense interest in the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Russia sought to control access from the Black Sea through the Dardanelles, while Britain were determined to maintain open access through the Suez Canal, a vital link to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. As such, both sought to exert influence over Istanbul as that great empire started to fray at the edges and to come apart at the seams. The intense rivalry of Britain and Russia dominated the latter part of that century, and it was obvious to even the most casual observer, especially in the rhetoric of the strongly anti-Russian statesman Palmerston. Yet a Scottish conspiracy theorist, David Urquhart, a lover of the Turk who was obsessed with Islamic culture, became convinced that Palmerston was actually a double agent for Russia. And Marx fell for his theory, hook, line and sinker. Urquhart was a particularly deranged polemicist, the equivalent of a rabid 9/11 truther who would have loved and would have made a big impact on the internet today. And Marx vocally supported his campaign for decades. He wrote several articles on Palmerston's clandestine support for Russia, and later collected his musings in a pamphlet called The Secret Diplomatic History of the 18th Century. That part of his canon was quietly deleted when Marx's work was translated into Russian. Urquhart's belief that Palmerston was a secret agent for Russia fitted the radicals' belief of the collusion and corruption of the ruling elites. So his ideas won widespread support. Yet it was a monstrous lap of judgment to claim that the overtly patriotic, anti-Russian Palmerston was a puppet of the Tsar, one who sought to undermine the interests of Western Europe in service to his Russian master. If Marx could make errors as egregious as this in relation to his peers, how on earth was he supposed to formulate an objective view of events in some distant, uncertain future? Yet it was upon this assumed ability that his entire philosophy and reputation rested. Marx was adamant that their secret pact would prevent Britain and Russia going to war. So when the Crimean War did see conflict break out between those two states in 1853, he simply brushed it off as a ruse to mask Palmerston's corrupt alliance. Some would have begun to question the accuracy of their beliefs. But this is something that Marx never did, which is why his views never changed, no matter how much contradictory evidence he was presented with. Marx claimed that Britain would lose that war, that Palmerston would sabotage his phony war to protect his Russian master, and he trumpeted Britain's early problems as incontrovertible proof of his claims. But when Britain turned the tide and won the conflict, it still failed to dent Marx's belief. He carried on claiming that Russian collusion had been behind every European disaster for a century, and that they had been successfully bribing every Whig politician in Britain for that whole period. As such, Marx dismissed the Great Reform Bill of 1832 and the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 as cynically manipulative policies, even as they benefited the slice of the population that Marx claimed to care about. Both he and Urquhart were convinced of the need to maintain the integrity of the Ottoman Empire in the face of Russian aggression. As such, he denounced the Greek insurgents who rose up against the Ottomans, precisely the sort of insurgents he had always sworn to defend against autocratic rule. He also sided with the Sultan when the Turks massacred thousands of Christians in the Bulgarian horrors. Marx was certain that both revolts were simply Russian conspiracies. To the leftists of the day, any act of Islamic terror was excused, and in Russia, they effectively defended suicide bombing too. In fact, Marx also believed that Bismarck's Prussia and Napoleon III's France were agents of Russia too. He was adamant that Bismarck was not the man to unite Germany, and that Prussia would never go to war with France. Both these forecasts were immediately proven wrong too, when Bismarck united the German states and thumped the French army in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. As for Urquhart, his obsession with Ottoman culture and his conviction in their restorative powers later convinced him to treat his 13-month-old son to a Turkish bath. The experience promptly killed the child. But Marx never lost his faith in his deranged mentor, or his adult conspiracies. And that's the right word, because Marx's views were determined by faith far more than they were by science or by reason. If you've enjoyed this film, please like and subscribe, and if you're interested in these topics, I've written 2 books which go into them in extensive detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.